This is the School Success Podcast, a podcast for school leaders to learn from other school leaders what's working and what's not, and to get inspiration and encouragement, as well as strategies to grow school enrollment, connect with families, retain teachers, recruit teachers, and everything in between. You guys are heroes, and I cannot thank you enough for pouring into this next generation that's coming behind us. My goal is you will take at least one thing away from every episode that you can take back to your school to make it better than it is right now. Please enjoy the School Success Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the Herzog Foundation.
Time for school.
Hey, School Success Makers. Welcome to another edition of the School Success Podcast. I'm your host, Mitchell Slater, and I'm joined by a new friend out of Denver, Colorado, Jamie Sowers, who is, guys, the advisory team director at 𝑏laZRWorks. And you might be like, maybe I've never heard of 𝑏laZRWorks before. Well, that's okay, because we're going to dive into all things 𝑏laZRWorks and what they do. And they do some really cool things. But specifically, Jamie does some really cool stuff that we actually have not had somebody on the podcast to talk about. And it's in the world of special education and what that looks like in schools across the country. And I am really excited to dive into this one today. But I do got to set the bar for this one, guys. So, as recording this, we're in the 8th or something, 7th, 8th of October, and Hurricane, oh my goodness, which one is it?
Milton.
Milton, thank you. See, I literally have my fake fog brain right now, is about to come and wreak some havoc on Florida. And so my family evacuated last night, drove through the night to get to the Carolinas. So I'm actually recording this in my wife's grandma's sewing room at their house. So that's fun because Jamie goes, the show must go on, Mitchell. And so I said, let's do it. We're going to do it. So it's just going to be a thing in the sewing room today for this School Success Podcast episode. But I'm excited for it. I didn't want to postpone it or cancel it. So to jump right in today, I don't have my mic, my famous good mic, so I think Jamie's going to sound better than me today. But before we jump into all the things, I do always want to pass it off to our guests to introduce themselves. So, Jamie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mitchell. Thanks so much for having me. And yes, I'm Jamie Sowers, living in safe, dry, and hot Denver right now. I just gotta set the record straight, Mitchell. You make me sound a little rough here. We could have rescheduled this anytime, but you are a true trooper for wanting to push through. And it's a shame the listeners can't see the backdrop because the sewing room is quite nice. But as you said, yes, I have the unique footprint of spending my entire career within special education, starting as a special ed teacher, moving into a coordinator role, building level principal, and then finally a special education director for a medium-sized school district before transitioning into this role with 𝑏laZRWorks, which the easiest way for your listeners to think about 𝑏laZRWorks is we are all things service for school districts and individual special educators, everything from ongoing training and mentorship, cutting edge research, professional development. So we are really put in place to lift up those individual educators and the school districts at large to make sure that ultimately the students are receiving the best services.
Love it. And if somebody does want to watch this one on the video, it's on YouTube. Most people I know listen to Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We do put the video on YouTube if you want to see this amazing sewing room that her grandma, works all over. So, so thank you for the introduction, Jamie. And I told you, I even give you a heads up on this question that's about to come at you. We always start with the same question for every guest before we jump into the nitty gritty. And it's, if I was to visit you in Denver, Colorado, what would you say I need to eat this and do this to experience Denver, Colorado?
All right. You need to eat Rocky Mountain oysters. Okay. I will not elaborate. That's what Google is for. And there's so much that you have to do, but you've got to go see a concert at Red Rocks. Arguably the best outdoor venue in the United States, and such an eclectic mix. I mean, depending on when you're here, you can see anything from jazz, hip hop, DJs, bluegrass. So it's just really cool, and you can't beat the view and just the acoustics of the rocks.
Perfect. You crushed it. See, I told you, everybody's crushed that one. So you carry on with the legacy. So good job.
I didn't want to lead on that I did do my homework, so I was ready for you.
All right. Good deal. Good. Well, now as we jump into the actual the nitty gritty, I would love to just dive into. I know we have kind of three main topics I'd like to hover around, and I'm hoping that, and I know our guests will be able to take something back from today's episode that they can use in their school. But kind of just starting it off with the first one we kind of chatted about, which is teacher retention. So this one comes up regularly with the clients we work with, as well as people we've had on the podcast, and they mention it pretty regularly, talking about like, man, they feel like they can't keep teachers. Maybe it's teacher pay, or maybe, of course, they're sniped from some other school district or another state. And you had spoken to that a lot about some strategies and some ideas on the teacher retention side. So I kind of love just let the conversation go a little bit, and let's talk about what are some of your ideas and strategies when it comes to teacher retention.
Certainly. And if I could start with, I think this kind of illustrates the picture. And so I graduated with my master's in 2003. So, yes, I'm old. But at that time, even within special education, which has always been the hardest to fill subspecialty of education, teachers, I was competing sometimes with 20 to 30 other teachers for a singular position. And just to paint this picture for the listeners, you flip it today where it used to be 20 to 30 teachers applying for one position. Now it's 20 to 30 positions with one applicant. And so in some cases, school districts are literally saying, where do we have the greatest need in this moment to make sure that we have a certified teacher in front of kids? So I hope that that kind of illustrates it. But the backstory here, I wrote my dissertation on teacher recruitment, and after I successfully defended it, my dissertation chair laughed at me and said, I can tell you this now, you really should have written it on retention. And so that struck a nerve, but you know what? He was exactly right. So, Dr. Crossan, if you hear this years later, I will still give you credit. You were correct. But from that day on, I just really started thinking about that way. And I don't know if I can take credit for this or not, but I love to coin and say recruitment begins with strong retention. And so in schools, we really need to look at why are people leaving and why aren't they coming into the field? And yes, money is part of it, but really what research will tell us is that people want to feel supported, they want to feel welcome, they want to feel part of a community, and they want access to the tools that they need to become better at their craft. And at no fault towards school districts, district administrators are pulled in so many different directions, but we don't see that happening. A lot of times you have administrators that are pulled in so many different directions, whether it's trying to get a purchase order to fix the roof or dealing with pickup and child drop off, all those things. And just our systems aren't set up so they can truly give the teachers what they need to feel supported. Again, ultimately, so that kids have that. And so, one of the things that we set out to do, and I was fortunate to start this team a little over 2 years ago, was put all of those things into place, albeit on a micro level, because we're small and we only have so much reach. But what can we do, and what systems can we put into schools, and how can we allow teachers and other education professionals to feel supported and empowered so that they can really feel like the true professionals that they are? And then the hope, to give a little bit of context to the recruitment begins with retention. If you get a workforce in a school and in a larger context, that district that really feels they have adequate support, access to that training, well, you just expanded your HR department and your recruiting department, because those people are going to go out and they're going to tell their friends, hey, you really want to work here. It's a great environment. It's a great school community, a great culture. We have a resource library. We have opportunities. We have extra funding if we want to attend a conference to learn more. And so, we only have time to skim the top of it, but those are what not only research will tell us, but what we've seen when we're visiting with educators and school districts around the country.
So there's a lot there, and I'd love to unpack a couple of them. So schools listening to this going, man, that sounds awesome. That's great. But there was a lot of things you mentioned. Is there one out of those that you would say, if a school's listening and maybe they're struggling in this area of like they want to make their retention better, is there one area to say, hey, just focus on one, and then once you get that one down, add another one that helps to like build up more value for a teacher. Is that something that they could potentially do?
Yeah, I love that. And it puts it into simple steps. And again, respecting I was a principal at the school level, you're always competing with varying interests for your time. If you can set aside an hour every day to walk the halls, check into classrooms, engage with students, engage with teachers, that alone sets the tone. And so, unfortunately, I can't remember the guy's name, but if you just Google the principal that uses a cart that gave up his office, he's becoming a little bit of a celebrity and he's really bought into social media, which gives an old guy like me hope. But he totally gave up his office and turned it in a conference room, and he uses like a podium on wheels and goes around. And so there's been a lot of studies done on that model now. And I'm not saying that you got to give up your office. I'm not saying that you can't be in your office. Everybody deserves some quiet time, some uninterrupted time to get work done. But the more you can just be present in the halls, the more that you can check in with the teachers. You know, ask them how their weekend was. Get to know them, because if we can connect with people, going back to simple human psychology, that connection is that first step in feeling valued. And so that's the number one. Just spend time out in the halls, get to know your teachers, make sure that they know that you are there as a support for them. And then I think the second thing is get solicit their input, find out what is important to them, because you can't prescribe something if it's not going to meet the needs of your staff. You might have a very veteran staff that feels that they are equipped with enough resources and enough knowledge. Maybe they need some fun activities like a staff luncheon or an in-service day where they do something outside the school. So I think it's important to empower the staff to hear their voices and find out what's important to them. And then lastly, the unfortunately, everything costs money these days. So check in with your district, find out what funds are available to you for conferences, for little things to break up the monotony of a school day, a school week, to make sure that you're treating the staff to a little bit of friendly surprises. It goes a long way. And so if you don't have a PTA, try to find volunteers that'll get some started. You don't have to shoulder all of this responsibility yourself.
What I love about the first two you mentioned is that they are free. Now, obviously, your time is worth a lot, especially as a leader head of school. But those were free. Walk in the halls for an hour a day, and that can obviously, I think, will pay dividends, like you mentioned over and over again. But those two were technically free, and of course, the third one, yes, it costs money, it costs funds. Would have you ever seen a school? Let's say they don't have funding from the district level, like hey, we're not going to help with that. Have you ever seen a school say, we're going to try and find some business sponsorships to say, hey, would you help provide some funding throughout the year if we give you this and this to give us maybe a few $1,000s, and we can say, hey, go to this conference, there's $200, or go to this online training. Have you ever seen anything like that for businesses to give to help the educators?
Certainly, that's a great point. And it varies based on community and all of that. But I would say if you're looking at kind of the spectrum, you've got that on one end, individual businesses that might be willing to donate some money. On the other end of the continuum, there are a lot of communities that have collaboratives in place that are nonprofits. A lot of times they're literally called partners in education. And many times you find that they are retired teachers, educators that want to stay involved and give back. And so they are spearheading philanthropic efforts in the community to raise money for just what you're saying. And so they become the holding entity, and most times they're 501c3s. So they become the holding entity of that money. And then individual schools, or sometimes it's multiple school districts, they can submit applications for funding. And it's very much like typical grant proposals where you have to put in what you plan to use the money for, what are your desired outcomes. But yeah, it runs the gamut from, again, independent businesses that many times have a foothold in the community to organizations that are put in place, colleges, universities, especially ones that have colleges of education. So again, we could go on about this forever, but would always be happy to follow up with any of your listeners to point them in the right direction.
Perfect. So it was perfect segue into like the kind of the second one we had talked about was like the financial cliff of like the special education sector. So I think the smaller schools that might be listening, maybe even the bigger ones, they're like, man, this costs a lot of money. I feel like to do this and do it well. So those are listening and maybe have those hesitations, but they want to be able to provide this service better. What are some of the things they can do to navigate that? You kind of mentioned grant writing and maybe some of these businesses sponsoring, but is there other maybe lower hanging fruit options from our U.S. government that can help with some of these things to help schools out?
Sure, and a broad span of listeners I know, and so for you district leadership veterans, I'm sure you're well aware of this, but hopefully this allows somebody that's new in a leadership role to learn something. But of all subgroups within public schools in the United States, those receiving special education services are the most protected. And I won't go into a bunch of legal backstory, but they are protected under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And with that comes not only federal funding, but also mandates to ensure adequate funding at the local level as well as the programming. So if you're a school district, to use really easy numbers, and you have 1,000 students that are receiving special education services, regardless of whether that money came from pandemic relief funds, state government, local municipalities, federal government, you have a legal obligation to continue that level of service year over year as long as you have the same number of students. And that's called maintenance of effort. Again, happy to go into a deep dive at a later date or with anybody that would like to know more. But the simple part of it is, given that there are those provisions in place to protect those students, therefore there is funding to come along with that. And now, again, another topic for another day. Could there always be more funding? Of course. Should there be more funding? Probably. But there should be adequate funding in place to ensure that all students with disabilities are receiving enough to provide a free and appropriate public education. In addition to that, there's a couple other things just for the listeners. Almost every state has some pot of money that is reserved for students that require more intensive services. And much to the example I gave earlier, where you would put a grant proposal in front of the local agency for extra funding, the system works quite similar when you need extra funding to ensure that a student in your district can receive more intensive services. And so, again, there's always going to be exceptions, but of all subgroups of students, those receiving special ed services are going to be in the best shape in terms of funding ongoing, regardless of what is happening in the economic climate.
So there's not like a finite amount of funding here that if there's only that it can only fund 900 kids, and if you get to 905, there's no funding for that that extra few kids. Is that, or is it kind of unlimited that's out there for this?
Well, nothing is unlimited.
Okay.
So it all depends. And, throwing a little humor in here, of course, it would make way too much sense if all 50 states operated the same way. And that's part of the joy of our country, is each state has their independence. From an education researcher standpoint, it can lead to a headache because then you're trying to figure out what happens in every state. So every state has some sort of emergency funding mechanism to address that very issue that you bring up. A family moves into the school district in October. They have a few children that require really intensive services. The district had not budgeted for those students, those services. What happens? And it varies by state to state. A lot of states have lag funding, meaning you don't get that funding until the next year, but there are provisions set up for that very instance. In addition, again, just to try to keep it at the surface level, but school districts are required to hold on to cash reserves, rainy day fund, if you will call it, for these very situations. And so, again, federal law that guarantees these services are put in place and upheld really helps not only ultimately the student and their family, but the school district be able to provide those services.
Okay. So, the, obviously, yes, it's expensive to, of course, to provide this. It's awesome that there is funds out there from the government, but it kind of, I do want to jump into the third question because it'll help me kind of bring things full circle that I have a question on. So you got Christian schools who would love some of this funding that serve, this clientele, as well as other schools that would want some of this funding. But I think at least I did before I talked with you. I'm thinking, oh, this is only for public schools, only for charter schools. But I think you had mentioned that this is available for any school that's out there. They just have to do the proper documentation, paperwork, and applying for this money. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it can be very complex, but there's a couple of points that I'll talk about. Number one, under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there is a provision that the local school district has to provide a small percentage of their services to private schools in the community. Now, where this becomes very confusing is that local school district does have authority in determining what those services are going to look like. So, in some cases, it might be evaluation services for parents that suspect that their child might have some learning loss or a learning disability. In some areas, it might be providing a speech therapist to the private schools in the community so that if a child is attending, like you said, a Christian school or a non denominational private school, they are still eligible for those services through the school district. In addition to that, and again, you have to look at your independent state. A lot of states are having measures go through their legislatures about voucher systems that would follow the student. And so, in states where that has already passed, there is a set dollar amount, regardless of whether your child is going to go to a traditional public school, a charter school, or a private school in the community. And lastly, I would say there are community resources available. And so, depending on the family's financial status, Medicaid eligibility, all of that, there are services available through the community that in some cases private schools will weave into their school so that the student can still receive those services during the school day, not inconveniencing the family to have to go elsewhere to find those. So, 50 states, however many private schools in each state, there's not a one size fits all. But my overwhelming theme is always communicate and ask questions. Look for resources, talk to the schools. If you're interested in sending your child to a private school, call the school and ask for a tour. Make a list of questions in advance that you want to ask. That's their job to let you know. And you can ask, what services do you have available for students that might need some extra learning help or maybe some extra behavioral help? Those are all within your rights, and as a parent, you should ask those questions. Again, I know I'm redundant, but that's part of what my role is. So would always be happy to have a conversation with anybody because I know it can be intimidating for parents if you've never been part of those conversations and are not really sure what questions to ask.
Hey, school success makers, Mitchell here. I just want to take a really quick break from the show to give a big, huge shout out to the Herzog Foundation. I absolutely love the Herzog Foundation. I've been friends and partners with them for a couple years now, but we're bringing it to a whole new level. And I'm excited to share that our very own School Success podcast is now featured on the Herzog Foundation Podcast Network. The Herzog Foundation is a powerhouse of resources designed to support schools like yours, from free training events through the Herzog Foundation Institute to their incredible online news publication, The Lion, and of course, our new podcast, Home. They have everything you need to stay informed and inspired. And if you're dreaming of starting your own Christian school or co-op, don't miss their online course, Schoolbox. It's a fantastic resource to help you get started on the right foot. At School Success, we're proud to partner with the Herzog Foundation to bring you these valuable tools and insights. So visit herzogfoundation.com to explore all they have to offer. Trust me, you won't want to miss out on these amazing opportunities for growth and success. And I love all the people over there, and I know you guys will too. So please, please go check them out, and you won't be disappointed. Now, back to the show. Is so you mentioned that obviously, yes, the parents should be asking these questions and putting those out there to the school. Is it Are the schools allowed to not take on a student that needs that extra help if they feel that they cannot provide the right resources, or maybe they don't have that funding available because they didn't apply for the right thing? Are they allowed to turn away a student for that specific reason?
Private schools can, if it's that they cannot provide the academic supports and services needed. What they cannot do is restrict access based on a physical disability. So, for example, think of the very simple, the accessibility, whether it's elevators for a multi-story building, something like that, because then the student has the same rights as anybody else for any building, and so they can't do that. But if it's along the lines of needing intensive academic supports, private schools do have a lot of leeway in that because they are not governed under IDEA and the same statutes as a traditional public school.
If a private school did get that funding and had a lot of it, could they are they start to almost get handcuffed, I guess, if you will, saying like, okay, we're a part of this, we're accepting these funds, but then we still pick and choose those students we want? Are they allowed to do some of that?
That's a very fine line that I really don't feel that I'm well informed enough on to talk about to the audience. I've worked with private schools quite a bit, but not to that level. What I can say with confidence is that the number of private schools that are driven specifically to work with students that have various learning needs, and the number of private schools that are accepting kids with those various learning needs is increasing rapidly.
Good.
And you've got a combination of private schools rely on enrollment to keep their doors open. And the other side of that combination is you've got a much more informed group of parents across the country that are aware of school choice and are really, for lack of a better word, shopping for the best educational opportunity for their children.
And in doing so, let's say, like I was just talking with somebody in California yesterday, and they get like, it's $10,000 a student is kind of what it averages out to for the year. If they do have the special education program and they're doing the IDEA, like, is it just another bucket on top? If it's 10, it's an extra 5, it's an extra 10 that they get from the state to help with a special needs student? Is it that simple, like that process?
It's not that simple, but that's a very simple way to think about it. There are multipliers based on many factors, and the easiest way to think about it is the more resources a child needs, the more funding the school will get for that child. And so that's all driven by the student's IEP. And that's why it's so important that not only the family, but all pertinent members of the academic team at the school are part of that meeting so they can really draft that document to show what the student needs in order to access and make progress in the general education curriculum.
Good. Okay.
So
So
that then drives the funding.
okay, and that makes sense. And I was obviously, as you're you're talking, I'm like, wow, I would never want to try and manage this all by myself. This sounds like there's a lot going on. So obviously, you've mentioned it a few times. I'd love you to mention it. If people are listening, they're going, I need more information, and I want to take them up on one of those calls. What's the best way they can get in touch with you or your team for a next conversation?
Sure, if you go to blazerworks.com, there is a tab on the website, advisory team, clinical advisors. You can find all of our bios, contact information there. It's a multidisciplinary team, so there are members on our team, everything from former teachers and administrators like myself, school psychologists, occupational therapists, you name it. We basically have professionals that that span the entire United States, as well as all of the specific disciplines that work with students with disabilities.
Awesome. And if it's a smaller private school and they're listening going, oh man, I don't know how much this is going to cost us. Is the first call free? I'd like to just have a conversation to figure out what it was there, make sure they're aware of what's the next step.
Sure, we'll talk to anybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. And obviously, guys, if you talk to Jamie, he's a fun guy to talk to. And he's got an awesome last name, too. I love the last name Sowers. I think that's awesome. So I always want to end with the same question I ask everybody. So for the school leaders that are listening, if you were to share one piece of advice with those school leaders, what would that one piece of advice be?
One piece of advice for school leaders: make sure, as cliche as this is, you are putting the oxygen mask on first. Being a school leader is one of the toughest jobs there is. You are responsible not only for every student in that school, but every staff member, and it's a lot. So make sure you're taking care of yourself, whatever that looks like: movement, religious, meditation, journaling, all of those things. And it's something that I don't believe educators do enough of, because by nature, educators are givers and they will always put everybody else first, which is wonderful. And that's why we all have big hearts. But at the end of the day, you have to take care of yourself, because if you are not in good shape, you can't be your best to lead a school.
That is excellent. And I just said this earlier, so I'll say it because my pastor at our church says this, and it applies to this situation here: is full things fill things. And if you're not full and getting filled up, you can't fill into other students and fill into others that are around you. So full things fill things. I think
I
that
love that. Do I have your permission to borrow that?
if you can have it. My pastor
All
got it, and I
right.
use it all the time because
All right.
the mental picture is awesome. So
Sure.
we'll
Yeah.
debrief here after this call, anyways. We can talk about some fun stuff here in a second. So obviously, Jamie, thank you for taking time out of your day to hop on this one. I'm glad we were still able to do it considering the circumstances. I know you have some of your team in Tampa that is evacuating, so praying that everybody's safe and good and we can weather the storm here the next 24, 48 hours. So as everybody's listening to this, they'll know what has happened at the storm. But thank you
Exactly.
for what you're doing to serve schools, to serve all those that are serving those students that need just a little bit more help here in the country. I love what you're doing. And thank you for hopping on and teaching me and teaching our listeners today.
Certainly. Well, once again, thank you so much for having me. It was a fun conversation.
Well, another huge shout out and a thank you to Jamie for taking time and being on the podcast today. I love what he's doing over there at 𝑏lazer_works, and I'm wishing them nothing but the best as they continue to help and support schools with special education help and all the other things that they do. I love what they're doing, and I loved our conversation today. And as always, you guys know I say this regularly, I'm hoping you're able to take at least one thing from today's episode that you can take back to your school to make it better than it is right now. I appreciate you guys being super flexible today, of course, as my family and I evacuated out of Florida to get away from Hurricane Milton, and obviously recorded this in my wife's grandma's sewing room. So shout out to Grandma for letting me use the sewing room, because it's not too bad in here. It's not too bad. So before I let you guys go, I will make sure to highlight the three things I want to make sure you guys remember and know, as I feel like my brain is very fogged after today, after all the driving. But the three things I want you guys to know, they are the three free things we offer here at School Success. And of course, the first one is the podcast, which you are listening to right now. Weekly episodes dropping every Monday. We want to make sure you guys are tuning into that. So if you're not yet subscribed, so you get notified when those drop, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you haven't yet left us a 5-star rating, we would love that. Obviously, this is a free resource we provide. We would love it's a free thing to do, just to give us a 5-star review, and we'd absolutely love and appreciate that. The whole team would. So go and do that. The second free thing we have is our School Success Report, and you can sign up for that on our website, schoolsuccessmakers.com. The top right-hand corner currently is a button called School Success Report. That is a weekly email that we send out with articles the team has written. We shout out and highlight a teacher that's in there. We have a couple other things we put in there every week. It's changing up a little bit. We want to make sure you guys are notified and are seeing those. The team works really hard to put that together. We want to make sure you guys are reading those and staying informed. Share that with other teacher friends. Again, a free resource dropping every Monday. And then the last one that I want to highlight is our free community on Facebook called School Success Makers. And I'm personally in there. Would love to see you guys in there as well. Feel free to just ask questions, connect with other teachers and people all over the country. And I think we even have some international ones. So it's an international community for school leaders. We'd love you being there. So go check it out. And guys, we're here to help you. We want to help you be successful and have a great school. So you can find out some other things that we offer and do on our website, schoolsuccessmakers.com. Go check it out. And if you have any questions, obviously, let us know and reach out. We're here to help. And we'll be back here next week with another awesome guest as usual on the School Success Podcast. We'll see you then. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the Herzog Foundation.